welcome our speaker today. And our speaker today is Keith Bowen. He was our district director in 2017-2018. He's been a parliamentarian for 4 or 5 times now. He says he has 9 cats, by the way.
6.
So, and I would like to introduce to you everyone, our speaker for today, Keith Bowen. Sir, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Estelle, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's session. As an introduction, I realize we only have an hour today, so we're going to try and be very succinct about the parliamentary procedure in this space, focusing mainly on how we deal with motions and amendments and different types of motions that we would have at a meeting. And I'm sure we would be able to, if you need additional information, have that discussion after the meeting is closed. But let's just start off with then about why do we have parliamentary procedure? I think one of the important things is people assume parliamentary procedure is something that's awkward or something that's difficult to learn, or maybe it's just a little bit too formal for a Toastmasters meeting, etc. The idea is that parliamentary procedure is there to actually try and facilitate discussion, facilitate debate, and make sure that we get to the outcome in an efficient manner, but also one that provides fairness for everybody. So the idea of parliamentary procedure is that every member of a particular assembly, whether it's the district council, whether it's a club meeting, we treat everybody the same, that there's justice and courtesy for all. We all have the rights to be able to participate in discussion. One of the things that does sometimes lead to the trick of parliamentary procedure is that we try and handle one thing at a time. We don't have 10 things sitting on the table and nobody knows what we're discussing at a particular point in time. And normally this is why we do these kind of discussions or education sessions, is that everyone understands where we are in the process, because a lot of the time it can be confusing if not everybody's on the same page. So the important thing, as we'll go through the idea of how we deal with motions, is try and make sure that everyone's debating the same thing at the same time and that we aren't on different pages, and so that we can get to an outcome more efficiently, but also give everyone an opportunity to discuss it. It is an important facet of parliamentary procedure is that the majority gets to make the call. It is a majority rule kind of approach that when we have a motion and it is approved, then the simple majority most of the time is good enough for that motion to carry. There are some instances where it needs a bigger majority because you're infringing on the rights of the minority, but at most of the times our process are about giving fairness, but also just reaching a decision efficiently. The idea then is that the minority must always be heard. There's always an opportunity for discussion. There will be some motions, and we'll go through those, where we don't debate, because maybe the whole point is that you kind of close the debate if it's dragging on forever. But those things also are decided on a 2/3 majority, so that there's still an opportunity for the minority to be heard and they're not being steamrolled by the chair in order to reach a particular outcome. So that's quite an important thing for us to consider. But the most important thing is that it's a facilitation tool. So in Toastmasters, we use Robert's Rules of Order, which is actually goes back over 100 years, where there was a sergeant in the US Army who went around and was interested in how in different places people use different rules for how you make decisions. And he put together a handbook to try and say, well, this is how, let's try and come up with common rules so that we all understand them and we make this work a lot simpler. And so obviously it is a US-based methodology, but as Toastmasters, we adopt that methodology. And if everyone then kind of is working from the same hymn book, it does help a little bit in terms of achieving the objectives and trying to make it smoother for us to be able to reach the decisions that we needed to reach. So what I'm going to focus then on for today is how we deal with motions. And there are different types of motions that might come to the floor, but mostly we are focusing on what we call the main motion. We're talking about someone has a proposal. It can be something that's on the agenda. So as we sometimes have at district council meetings, we will have an alignment or a district alignment, or we have something where it's an official motion that comes from the cabinet or another official for us to adopt something as district. It could be the budget, it can be the finance manager's report, etc. Those are official, they go onto the agenda, and then we know about them up front. But there are also other kinds of motions which would then be from the floor. And mostly because we've been online for the last 4 or 5 years, we tend to also then try and get those motions beforehand so that it can go onto the agenda and people can get warning. And it also helps, particularly if you are online, that we can manage how the process would work. But often in the room, then people can come up with motions from the floor. And what we talk about now is how we actually do that and what's the process to allow for people to provide for those motions. Firstly, even if it's on the agenda or if it's someone who's raising their hand from the floor, the chair will always ask for the member to identify themselves. Particularly in Toastmasters, we often ask that it's, whether it's a district leader or it's someone from a club, that they identify themselves and where they're from. Then they can propose their motion. Motions are also really important that we're not asking for the Declaration of Independence here. We're not asking for a UN resolution. You just need to know what it is that we need to decide on. The motivation is never part of the motion. The motivation will be coming from the proposer when they get a chance to speak to the motion. So the idea is that the motion should be succinct, get to the point, but be very specific if there are issues that need to be decided as part of that motion. And I'll show shortly what some of those would look like. The idea then is that somebody has to second that motion, even if it's an official motion. So it's coming from the district finance manager to adopt the budget. Somebody has to second it. Similarly, if it's coming from the floor, there has to be a seconder. I have seen it done before where somebody makes a proposal, puts up a motion, and nobody seconds it. It dies immediately. There has to be a seconder. Technically, the seconder is basically saying this motion is important enough for us to consider, that we need to put this on the table. It doesn't mean that the seconder automatically supports the motion. It's an interesting kind of aside that sometimes the seconder just wants it to be debated because it's important, may not necessarily agree with the motion, but wants them to consider it. I've been thinking, like, what kind of example would we have? Let's say somebody wants a motion to say the next district council meeting must be on Robben Island. And somebody wants us to talk about the next district council meeting or the next conference, but not necessarily Robben Island. So they kind of want it on the table. So we have the discussion, and through the process of amendments, which we'll also go into this morning, we come to a different decision. But at least it's been debated and everyone's comfortable with what the motion ends up as. But so sometimes it's important then that the presiding officer, once the motion has been made and seconded, the presiding officer will then place the motion before the group. If there are wording issues, and sometimes the wording issues can be important, we kind of just then do a little bit of work with and normally there's a parliamentarian in the room to kind of help with some of the wording to make sure that it's aligned with the outcome that we're really expecting. So when we talk about some of the motions, sometimes a parliamentarian might rule that the motion is out of order, or the chairman rules it on the advice of the parliamentarian. And these would normally be where the assembly that we're dealing with doesn't have the right to make that decision. So my example is here, the district must reduce the semi-annual dues to $18. District doesn't have that right because it's set by a higher authority, which is the board of directors. So that would automatically be ruled inadmissible. We can't deal with it, and it's removed from the table. Sometimes someone might say something about how the sound equipment is bad and then, go through a whole justification for the motion. As I put there kind of almost facetiously, my cousin John runs a sound shop and can get us a good deal. And that's part of the motion. We would say, well, we don't really need to know about that. I think we just need to deal with the detail. And we also definitely don't want to get into an ethical debate about where we're going to get the sound. But the idea is, if there's a specific requirement, we would then discuss that, but it's always possible that the chair can rule something out of order. Just to highlight, mostly the chair's decision is final, but there are specific motions, and I'll come to those later, where you can override the chair. If there's a majority of the people in the room say, no, we must discuss this, then the chair kind of gets overridden by the room. But ordinarily, the chair guides the whole process and would declare something inadmissible, and also then guides who gets to speak to the various motions. So once we have the motion on the table, principally all motions then are open for debate. There are some instances where a motion won't be, and I'll come to those, but those are very specific types of motions. But ordinarily, if somebody has raised a motion, it's been seconded, then we then need to proceed to a debate. The timing of the debate can be limited. The chair can make some rulings around timing of the chair, particularly if the agenda specifies a timing. That can also help to make sure that we don't spend hours on a particular debate. Also, there are some what we call supplementary motions, subsidiary motions that will actually allow you to cut the debate if it's going on for too long. And that's normally when the assembly, the members decide this has been dragging on too long and the chair hasn't made a ruling. They will then can actually shut the debate down. But again, that also requires a 2/3 majority because there's always a risk that you're steamrolling a minority in that process. Once the debate has closed, whether it be that nobody else wants to speak to the motion, that there hasn't been additional inputs, or that we've had a vote, that the motion now closes, we go to the vote. One of the important things, firstly, before the vote comes in, is that in the debate, it's ideal and preferable that you actually have moving between people who propose or support the motion and those that oppose. It usually always starts with the proposer. In our code of practice in District 74, we give 3 minutes to the proposer of a motion for them to lay out why this motion needs to be adopted. And that's where that motivation comes in. It doesn't become part of the motion itself. It's when the speaker gets an opportunity to say what they need to say at that point in time. Then you would start moving. The chair needs to then look for people who want to speak against the motion, then for, then against, then for, then against, and so forth, all the way through. Ordinarily, it's proposed that you don't allow people to speak twice unless nobody else is willing to speak. So it might be that someone's made a point, but now they want to follow up because somebody has argued against their point. You don't normally allow that until the rest of the assembly has had an opportunity to speak. In district, we often also have the practice that the proposer gets to wrap up and give a final view. That's not normal in terms of the Roberts rules, but it's allowed that you kind of can have that wrap up and then you move to the vote. Importantly, there are different ways that we handle the voting. We're not going to go into the voting here, but there are obviously, because there will be using the voting devices, etc. It's slightly different, but the idea is that you can use, so the chair can actually just call for a voice vote. All those for, all those against, just to get a sense. And if it's overwhelming, if it's very clear that one side is like lots of yes or lots of no's, then you don't need to proceed any further. And you can say, right, the ayes have it or the no's have it, and then we move on to something else. It is possible that if somebody objects, they can actually call for a division, and that means that you actually have to then proceed to a vote. Because if people are concerned that it's not clear, and maybe the chair is biased or the chair hears one side more than the other, then you need to move to a vote. But often it's not the case. And so that means that you can save time by having the voice vote and moving on. Sometimes, like for example, even when we adopt an agenda, and you'll have seen it at some of the district council meetings, if the agenda has been circulated, the chair will, at the beginning of the meeting, have a motion, either themselves or usually it's with a third party to actually propose the motion and someone to second, that we adopt the agenda. The chair will just ask for any objections. And that means that it's kind of like a voice vote, but it's just basically hearing. If nobody objects, then let's just move on. We don't have to get into the complicated procedure of that. So again, this is where parliamentary procedure helps us in that process. So we try and facilitate things that are not controversial, get them done quickly so we can get stuck into the things that are maybe controversial. So the idea is then, obviously, we start with if there are objections, we then can move on to a voice vote, and then thirdly, you go to a proper vote where you either have paper or you have electronic devices or whatever, show of hands, whatever the process is in that particular point in time, and that then kind of concludes with the resolution. As I said, most of the motions that we're dealing with today are purely majority vote, 50% plus one, and then that carries the motion. There are specific motions that do require 2/3, as I said, particularly if it infringes on the rights of others. If you want to cut the debate, it has to be a 2/3 majority. And so you've got to then go and make sure that we're not infringing on the rights of others. If it's not, then just the majority rules will carry, and then the chair will announce the results to everyone. What we're going to do now is talk about these different motions. So as I said, the most important one is the main motion. The main motion is what was proposed. And then we start looking at how do you process the main motion. And I'm going to give a couple of examples as we go through. But the idea is then the first thing that happens, we've got our proposer, seconder, we've now got the debate open. We've gone through the process. Everyone knows what we're debating. And as we step in, one of the first things that can happen is that someone proposes that we postpone indefinitely. Now, this becomes quite an interesting kind of process, because to postpone indefinitely means that there might well be people in the room who just don't want this thing discussed. It's controversial, it's embarrassing, or and we've also had I've seen this done in other places where sometimes it might be something it's embarrassing to a member if it's a censure motion, which has happened in district many, many years ago, and you kind of don't want to actually go down this road, then you can actually put it to a postponement indefinitely. That just means that it goes off the table. So here, the indefinite postponement, it does have to be seconded, so it can't just be one person wanting to take it off. It can itself be debated, which is interesting to debate whether or not we want to debate something. But then when it's adopted, and again, this can be a majority decision, it's gone. It kind of gets taken off the table, and then it kind of can't get raised again at the current meeting. So that's one way if something is raised by a member, even if it is seconded, and other members don't want to discuss it, that they can kill the debate immediately. You've always got to be careful that it's not abused, but it is an important thing, because again, it's a majority rule to kind of say we don't want to go down this road. When we talk about amendments, though, amendments are quite an important process, and I'm going to spend some time on it, because this is often where the wheels can come off. I was saying to Estelle earlier that, I remember years ago, what got me interested in the parliamentary procedure was when we had an amendment, we had an motion, and then people started amending the motion, and it got a little bit hairy as to where we were in this motion, because we weren't sure what we were debating at a particular point in time. So it's quite important that everyone understands this. Ideally, what happens, an amendment is allowed if it's a change to the wording of an existing amendment. It must not be something that reverses the motion. So if the motion was, as I said, we will have the next district conference at Robben Island, someone can't put in an amendment to say we will not have the district conference at Robben Island, because now that's reversing it. Anything that gets amended must be, as the phrase goes, germane to the motion. It must be something that is important to how that motion then gets carried. And it's not something completely arbitrary and from left field that now isn't important for what we're discussing at a particular point in time. And so that becomes quite an important consideration for the chair to make sure that they're keeping on top of how this works. So as I mentioned, usually you can insert words, you can add words, append them to the end, you can strike out words, or you can do both as part of an amendment. So if I'm going to use a very facetious example, but just to kind of like help. So this is now at a Toastmasters meeting. We then have a motion that the national anthem be sung at the start of every meeting. And someone has proposed it. It's all gone through the motion, through the process of putting it on the table. It's seconded, and the chair says, fine, let's discuss this. Then someone comes along and says, as an amendment, but they want the Sesotho verse to be sung solo by the Vice President Education. Okay, so now that's an amendment to kind of like, it is still germane, it's to the point of singing the national anthem, but putting on a special condition. And so then that is proposed, that is seconded, and then we start discussing that. What makes this interesting in terms of the amendment is, and this is where sometimes the wheels come off, is to understand that we're not talking about the main motion anymore. We're talking about the amendment as to whether the amendment is what people want. We still got to come back to the main motion afterwards, either amended or otherwise. And Tim Knights often has a fantastic way of explaining this, is that whether or not you support the motion is whether you feel that if the motion were to carry, this amendment would make it better or more acceptable or whatever it is. So when we're discussing the amendment, we've still taken the consideration that maybe the main motion could be carried. There's also a possibility it could be rejected, but we've got to deal with making it better and making it more acceptable. So in this instance, someone's put in the amendment and that then gets discussed. In the Robert's Rules of Order, it's also then allowed that you can do a second amendment. That now you can say, well, if that's the amendment, I want to add something to that. I want the harmonies to be sung by the secretary. And now you start discussing the issue about the harmonies and the secretary, and you ignore completely whether or not the national anthem is going to be sung or whether the Sesotho verse is sung by the VPE. You're focusing now on the harmonies to be sung by the secretary. We also, under Rules of Order, don't allow for a third amendment. So now if someone were to come along and say that they don't want the secretary to sing it, we're going to replace the secretary with the sergeant. Technically, that's not allowed. The chair would not allow that to happen because it's introducing a third level and it's now just making things really messy. So the proposal or the mechanism under Robert's Rules of Order is that we have to allow no more than 2 concurrent amendments. Once the amendments are resolved, you can always come back and change it again. You don't, if it's adopted and the amendment carries through to the next level, you can come back later and change the secretary to the sergeant, but we're not going to go through the process before we've even decided whether the second amendment carries, whether to discuss whether it's the secretary or the sergeant. So the idea then is that the third amendment would never be allowed. We go back to dealing with the second amendment, and let's say in this example, the second amendment carries. And so now it's basically the amendment that we're coming back to discussing is the amended First Amendment. Okay, so this is where it's important to bear this in mind. So now the harmony sung by the secretary said, yes, if the majority says, if this motion is going to carry, we want the harmonies to be sung by the secretary. So now that's part of it. So now the motion that we're looking at is the First Amendment, which says, and the Sesotho verse be sung solo by the VPE and the harmony sung by the secretary. That's what we're discussing. And that's what we've got to finalize and move on from there before going back to the main item. And this is important because it's still the idea that we haven't yet even decided whether we're doing the national anthem, but we're trying to make sure that everybody's happy with the way in which the national anthem is sung, and kind of so that we can move on to the main point. So when that is then resolved, we then say it's rejected. The amendment was rejected. We now come back to the initial wording, and unless, of course, assuming that there are no further attempts to amend it, that main motion can now come to the vote. And then the idea is, if it's carried, the motion then becomes that the national anthem be sung at the start of each meeting. Okay, so this is an important thing, and what it means, and the reason, as you can see it, that having it up on the screen helps, is that the admin manager and the parliamentarian, while the meeting is going on, particularly at a district council meeting, have to be able to almost project where we are in terms of the motions, so that everybody knows what we're debating. And I think that's often where it becomes tricky to know at what step we are in the process to make sure that we get to the right decision. So now that that's resolved, we can basically say that it's approved, and then we can move on. There are other motions, which we call the subsidiary motions, that have the same kind of rights as an amendment. So the amendment's focusing on the wording and how we adopt and deal with the wording of the motion. Then we have some other motions which are also equally important. They just kind of deal with different things. The one, which is also quite powerful, is a refer to a committee. And so the idea is that if somebody has proposed, if we come back to the example of the national anthem, someone could say, well, I would like to refer that to a committee, and then can set the timelines for the committee must report back before the next meeting, or in 3 weeks with a suggestion, etc. And that can then be a new motion that's then discussed, and we kind of then wait to discuss that before we come back to the main motion. So the example that I was using earlier about the next conference being at Robben Island is that someone could say, well, I want to determine where the next conference is going to be. Let's set up a committee to be chaired by the program quality director to discuss the next conference, and they must report back by the end of the month. And so that could be a motion. What that means, though, is that also has to be seconded, So anything we refer to the committee, the motion must be seconded. It becomes amendable, so that itself can start being amended. Particularly if someone doesn't like the timeline or who's on the committee, you can start discussing that, and that can also really take you down a rabbit hole all on its own. But the idea there is that at the end of that process, you can then say, right, we've now decided who the committee is and the timelines. If we vote on that, then the underlying motion is taken off. It goes to a committee and it'll come back later. We actually did this kind of probably not in quite that same way. It was a little bit clunky years ago when there was a proposal for Mauritius to become a member of District 74. This was before the Reformation, and we kind of went through a lot of stuff. And then at the end, we actually did decide to refer it to a committee. But the idea is that there's actually a way to do it formally by saying refer to committee, and then everyone votes on that, and then it's kind of taken away for the committee to come back later, and we'll reconsider when the committee comes back with their report. Sometimes you can also do a postponement to a specific certain time. And the idea here is that it's different from postpone indefinitely. Postpone indefinitely is you kind of just taking it off the table when it's never going to come back. Here you say we want to postpone until we've got more information. So it might be that we postpone till the end of the meeting or after the coffee break, and people can go and deal with other issues and have that discussion and come back. There could be a particular reason why you want to postpone, and for a specific time. It just removes the item and then comes back a little bit later. Yeah, sure, Isaac, go for it.
Thanks, Keith. I want to find out, what if you're happy that the motion is referred to a committee, but before but you're not comfortable with just letting it be referred to committee without effective guidelines. So you want to be sure that the committee has considered X, Y, and Z, that they've consulted widely, that they've taken various things into account, that the outcome is actually a credible outcome with a credible process, rather than just the committee has announced, and now you're stuck with a motion that still nobody actually likes.
Yeah, that's a great question. The idea is that then in the motion to refer to committee, you can specify information that you want the committee to consider. So first you can decide who's on the committee, what time or when they must report back by, but the council or the assembly can also specify that we need you to consider X, Y, and Z. The problem is the more complicated you make the motion, you always have to be aware that there's going to be more discussion and amendments to that, but it's entirely possible. It's totally within the rules to try and define how the committee must reach a decision, and that is quite a good guidance. But you've just got to be aware that it is open for debate when you actually almost kind of want to move it away so that the committee can come back with a proposal. Don't forget that the whole idea is that the committee doesn't then, when you refer to committee, they don't make the decision. It still comes back for a decision of the assembly, but they come back with a suggestion or a proposal. But if you want to guide what they discuss or how they go and research it, that's also entirely possible within that process of referring.
Okay, thanks very much for that
Cool,
response.
thanks. Yeah, so then the idea of the postponement to a certain time is that importantly, it can be carried by a majority, that you can postpone to a week or the next meeting or to the end of the meeting. But if something's on the agenda and somebody wants to postpone it, it's important then that it's actually carried by a 2/3 majority, because it's effectively changing the agenda, and the agenda was adopted by the committee. It comes back to this idea that parliamentary procedure must not be used as a tool to ride roughshod over the minority. And this happens regularly, and we've seen it often if you look at American debates in the House of Congress, that sometimes people use parliamentary procedure to kill motions or to stop things happening or to delay things. And that can be dangerous if it's something that kind of needs to be finalized. And so the idea here is that specifically, if you've got an assembly that meets, so let's say it's a club meeting every 2 weeks or every week or whichever your timelines are, and you put on the agenda that we were going to discuss this, and then come to the meeting, then people are like, oh, we don't actually want to resolve this now because you don't have the right people at the meeting, or we don't think we're going to get the decision we want. They then postpone to the next meeting. To try, and then it becomes a problem because the people who knew the thing was on the agenda and actually bothered to pitch don't want this now to get moved away and not be debated. So it's also something that can be abused, and you need to make sure then that you are essentially using it effectively. So if it does change the agenda, it must be 2/3. Otherwise, it can proceed to move it to another point in time. To limit or extend the debate is also quite useful. Again, this in itself is not debatable, so someone can propose it. It does need to be seconded. And then if it's, like, let's say, for example, to limit debate. So now we had 20 minutes on the agenda for a particular discussion, and 10 minutes in, people are feeling that we're going nowhere in this discussion and you want to stop it and move to the vote. That's a limit of the debate, and it takes away the rights of the minority to be heard. It then needs to be carried by a 2/3 majority. Okay, so it's not something that you can arbitrarily decide so that the majority can just shut down the discussion. It needs to then normally deal with the motion that's carried. Sometimes that can apply. So in my example where I had all the different amendments, you can actually limit the debate on the entire motion. It can focus either on the current motion, which is, let's say, amendment number 2, and shut down amendment number 2, so we go back to amendment number 1, or it can shut down all of them. And that can be specified as part of the limit. So if we felt like we've been discussing this national anthem thing for too long, we basically limit the discussion, shut it down, and move directly to the vote on all 3 motions. And that's the fun part, because now you have to start with the top motion, which would be the harmonies, and they kind of resolve that first. Then you go back to whether the VPE sings the Sesotho version, and then you go back to the main, and all of them get voted. There's no further debate. So that's also a tool for the majority, and particularly the overwhelming majority, because it's a 2/3 majority, to just kind of cut it down if they feel like it's been going on for too long. And the same is also for the previous question. It's the same kind of concept of limiting the debate. When someone raises a motion of that we now adopt the previous question or apply the previous question, the idea is that we shut down the debate and then we do the votes immediately. Laying on the table is also another subsidiary motion where you can put something aside. It's an interesting phraseology in the US that comes from the US, where you lay something on the table means that you actually put it aside. We're not discussing it. And that's different from tabling a motion, which is more the sort of UK English that we kind of talk about a lot. When we table a motion, it's when you're putting it on the table for discussion. In the Robert's Rules of Order, and also in American kind of like when you lay something on the table, you're putting it aside. You're taking it out of the discussion because we don't want to deal with this anymore. Normally, in the normal state of affairs, you might lay something on the table if something has happened. The example in the book is basically that the mayor has walked in to make a presentation. They've been late, and now they've come in, and we were debating something. You can have a quick motion to lay something on the table. It just means you put it aside temporarily, have the minister or the mayor's input, and then when they're gone, we can take it back up again. And this is a simple majority. Okay, so this is why it can be abused. As a simple majority just says, we're putting this aside and we're coming back to it. So you need to make sure that it's very clear from the chair's perspective that this is not killing the debate. It's not indefinitely postponing. It's just temporarily putting something away and then making sure it comes back when the time is right to do that. So that's also a powerful motion that can be used for that. In terms of all of these, the important thing to note is that these are all seconded. Everybody has. It can't just be one person deciding we're shutting this thing down now. It's got to be seconded. So it means that there are other people who want the same thing to make sure that we go onto it. Some of them are debatable, as I said. Some are not. So most of it, when we debate it to make sure that everyone's agreed that this is the right approach. And then when it's voted on, We then some of them will be 2/3 majority, and some will just be a majority, and then we can move on to the next thing. So it's important that none of them interrupt a speaker. I'm going to come to some motions, or privileged motions, as we call them, where you can interrupt the speaker. But in this case, you always have to let someone finish have their say. And in code of practice, we allow 2 minutes for everyone to speak. At the end of the 2 minutes, they will be automatically interrupted to make them stop. But the idea is you don't interrupt a speaker with a subsidiary motion. You let them finish. But then you can interrupt the course of the debate to move on to something else and introduce a subsidiary motion, but it must always be once and given the right for a speaker to at least conclude their input to the session. The privileged motion, so this is an interesting one where generally you can interrupt speakers, not in every case, but the idea here is that there are things that need to take precedence. Okay, and so, for example, when we're looking at raising a question of privilege or looking at calling orders of the day, you can interrupt a speaker if you feel that there's a reason that you have to give them better information. So, the orders of the day, when someone calls for orders of the day, this is again not something you vote on, or it's just basically reminding the chair that we have strayed from the agenda, specifically around timing. And it's been used, I've seen it used quite effectively in previous district council meetings where we were going for such a long time, and of course there was a Springbok rugby match or something on later in the afternoon, and people felt that the time had come to an end. Someone did a calls for the orders of the day because the agenda said that we were going to finish at this time, and no matter what happens, it kind of basically brings the whole thing to an end because the agenda must be followed regardless. So the idea is that it can override debate, particularly if the time has run out, or if someone feels that the debate has just gone way off what the point of the agenda was and brings it back. So that's quite an important and very powerful tool. We also have to make sure, again, the chair needs to make sure it's not abused to shut down discussions. The one on the question of privilege, this is also quite important. The privilege is not a previous district director having some sort of privilege that nobody else has. When we talk about privilege, this is privilege for that some members of the audience can't hear, or somebody's feeling that they missed they're not seeing where we are on the agenda or something. Raising a question of privilege, you can interrupt a speaker. It's almost like the idea that you need to get better information, or you need to know something, or you just can't hear. You can raise a question of privilege. The important thing is that it can interrupt a speaker, particularly if people can't hear the speaker, but it's just for the chair to be able to fix something rather than move the debate. It doesn't change the debate or anything like that. It's just about trying to make sure that everybody has the same rights in the meeting. So the privilege here is for all the members to have the same privileges when it comes to the discussion. In terms of the concept of the recess or adjourning, so recess is the idea is that the assembly can go into a recess. If everyone's getting tired, you don't want the discussion to end. You don't want to adjourn. You don't want to close the meeting, but you just want to take a break. Then someone can basically say, I call for a recess. It must be seconded. It can be amended, which of course, oh my word, just takes you down another rabbit hole. If someone says, can we have a recess of 15 minutes? And someone says, we want 30 minutes. And then you start debating whether it's 15 or 30. But, hopefully the chair would be able to just say, let's just go with the 30 or something. But the idea is, you basically can, there's no debate. It can be amended without debate, but then if the majority takes it, then we're going to go into a recess. But the principle here is that you come back afterwards. It's not adjourning. You are going to come back to discuss in the future. The idea for adjournment, though, adjournment shouldn't be applied while there's an existing motion being discussed. Okay, recess can, and the recess will bring you back, but an adjournment to kind of shut down the meeting can never actually be applied when there's something already on the table. So we need to make sure that we're using it correctly. Calls for orders of the day can close the meeting, etc., particularly if we've run out of time. But adjournment, if there's a motion that's carried, it's purely to just say that we are finishing the meeting, but it must be that it's after a main motion has been concluded. So it's not meant to interrupt the main motion. And then the fixing the time to which to adjourn is kind of similar to the adjourning, but here it's more about making sure that we come back at a certain time. So it's a little bit like the recess, but you're going to say we will reconvene in a week's time with better information. And that's the idea then, that you can do all of them. They're very similar. There are nuances between them, but the idea here is that you can use it to kind of interrupt the flow of things. You just got to make sure that the chair is managing, that we're not going to cause a problem for that. Then in terms of incidental motions, again, a lot of these can interrupt a speaker. And here it's about getting additional information or trying to look at how we deal with a particular question. So the point of order is specifically looking at getting information. There's no motion. Nobody has to kind of vote on it. It's just somebody says, on a point of order, can we get confirmation that this is the position? And sometimes it could be similar to a request for information. So you basically need some info to make the decision. But it also can be that somebody's arguing that what the chair has decided is not correct, and that the chair needs to look at a different reading of that. So sometimes that does mean that often there means there's a bit of a pause as we try and sort that out, and the chair goes and looks and just consults before we move on. But generally, it's just really trying to get better information rather than trying to break up the meeting or cause problems. And we know in South Africa how interesting that becomes when people keep using points of order when the speaker or trying to interrupt a speaker all the time. And so it's something where the chair has to manage what that means, but it's the idea to fix if something is wrong. Now, an appeal is where the chair has ruled on something and people aren't happy with the outcome, or particularly two speakers, because again, it has to be seconded. Someone can appeal, it's seconded, and then you move directly to a vote, basically. And it's only debated if the motion that you're appealing or the action that you're appealing is debatable. But otherwise, the appeal goes directly to the vote, because it might be to overrule a chair's decision and make sure that we go back. And then like everyone says, no, we don't agree. We want to proceed on this basis. And that can be the subject of the appeal. As I said, the request for information is generally about getting additional information. That's just interrupting a speaker to say, but I understood you to say X, is this really the case? And then you get a clarification and you move on. Suspending the rules is to potentially change the agenda or the standing rules, and that usually means that it's a 2/3 majority, because you're changing something that has already been decided. So you need to make sure that the suspension of the rules is used. This doesn't change the constitution of the meeting or the bylaws, so it's not suspending the rules of the assembly. It's merely talking about suspending a procedure. It's a procedural vote rather than changing the constitution or the rules of the assembly itself. Okay. Now, the objection to the consideration of a question is similar to the idea we were talking earlier about if we want to postpone indefinitely. But normally this now, it needs to be carried by a 2/3 majority, and usually has to happen before the debate starts. So whereas the postpone indefinitely can happen at any point in the session, an objection to the consideration of a question could be done immediately. We've had this before, and to good effect, where somebody put through a motion and it was agreed that the motion was fine, and then somebody raised an objection to consideration because it actually violated a standing order of the board of directors, which always takes precedent to anything that district does, and that means that they were ruled correct. The objection was upheld, and so then the motion was removed because it was incorrect for us to have done that. It's just the chair and the parliamentarian and everybody else involved hadn't picked that up, but someone who knew the rules really well was able to say, no, you can't discuss this, and so that objection then kind of can shut that discussion down. The important, in terms of the division of a question or consideration by paragraph seriatim are to break up a motion if it's complicated. And we've done this in the past, for example, when we talk about an alignment. And the alignment can be quite messy because you're dealing with multiple divisions and movements and things like that. And it could be felt by the assembly that we need to then do it division by division. And we have done that before, where you break down. So the motion was to approve the alignment, and then it was requested, can we break that down to approving the alignment division by division? And it was done that way. Sometimes it could be where, as I was talking about earlier, you have a motion for where the conference is going to be. It could be that it could have multiple elements to it, like we talk about the conferences for the next 3 years. You then can break that down into a division of the question. If that's normally, again, it's looks at it that the chair could rule that that's okay, or it could be a motion that actually has to be approved itself. But ordinarily, this could be something where the chair just says, yeah, that makes sense, let's do that. And then you work through the motion bit by bit. It does mean you have to consider each one as a main motion, get them approved before you move on to the next one. So each one of them would be amended. And so you have to deal with each of those subcomponents. And then at the end of it, it's done. You don't have to bring the whole thing back to approve after it. Oh, no, actually, I'm wrong. You still do. Particularly if you're doing the paragraph seriatim, if you've gone through it paragraph by paragraph, you then have to come back afterwards and say, right, now that we've amended all the paragraphs, we come back and we're going to approve the final motion. So there's still that outstanding item that the original motion must be finally approved. As I mentioned previously, the division of the assembly is really where somebody wants to confirm the vote. If they don't agree with the decision of the chair in terms of, like, particularly if we're doing a voice vote and they want that division, the division then means you move to a vote. And that would ordinarily be if it's a close thing and they don't agree that the chair made the right ruling in either direction. And that usually is quite often the danger of voice votes, or even if the showing of hands, making sure you count correctly, because if it does come a close thing, then we do need to move to a division to make sure that the chair has picked up the idea of how of what's meant to happen. There are just lastly 2 additional motions that I just want to talk about quickly before we close, and I know we're getting pretty close to our end. These we have also used previously in the district, and they're quite important to get right, because it is a risk that if you get it wrong, you can make a hash of things. And one of them is to reconsider a motion, and the other is to rescind a previous motion. So the reconsideration is really where, at a previous meeting, the Assembly made a decision. And now we want to come back and look at that. Ordinarily, the reconsider might be done in the same meeting. We try not to do that at a successive meeting. One of the most important reasons is that, again, it can be abused by people who are waiting for other people to leave the room, or to make sure at the next meeting that the people who supported this motion are gone, so that you can change the outcome. So it's really important that that when you kind of bring it back, it's reconsidered. Usually it has to be proposed by someone who voted on the side of approving it in the first round. So it's not like the opposition sitting there waiting for an opportunity. The people who supported it the first round, at least one of them, has to say, actually, we've got new information that's come to light. We would like to reconsider this. And that means that you come back, it comes back onto the table, and that you then look at it again with the new information, and then you decide. It could be that you still consider we carry on with this motion, but it's really important that it can't be the opposition waiting for opportunities to change the outcome in their favor. Rescinding, on the other hand, can be done at any time to rescind, but to rescind you have to have 2/3 majority. And it doesn't have to be, this one doesn't have to be proposed by somebody who voted with the majority in the first time. It can be the minority just kind of wants to come back and discuss this again. But again, we always have that risk that you just try, and then they will try and make sure that their supporters are present at the meeting to get a different outcome. But the idea is that mostly it could be because of better information, that whatever we used previously we had a problem with, we can then come and reconsider that. So those are the two and again, I've seen them used previously, and they also, you always have to make sure that they're not abused, but they can be quite useful for us to be able to then kind of deal with specific items. So let me go back just in the last couple of minutes to kind of back to some of those examples again to highlight now when we have a different process happening. So where we had our main motion in terms of the national anthem, we had our First Amendment, and in the discussion of the First Amendment, even after, and this was the one that's been amended itself by the Second Amendment, someone would then come and say, let's refer this to the committee. And they were basically taking it off. And in the discussion for the refer to the committee, somebody else could come along and say, oh, actually, it's time for a coffee break or something else is happening. Let's just lay it on the table. And so then the laying on the table takes precedent. I didn't go through it in this, but in the Robert's Rules of Order, there is a great chart of motions. And normally I always make sure that, the parliamentarian or the district director and others, if you're chairing a meeting, that you have a copy of the chart of motions in front of you, because there are these levels of precedence. Some things can interrupt other things. Example, a main motion can never interrupt a refer to the committee, because that means that you're bringing in a new motion. But a refer to committee can interrupt the amendment. A lay on the table can interrupt the refer to committee. And so there's this almost hierarchy of things that you can do. And again, it's a procedure. It's not, there's no natural law that makes this work. It's just the common understanding that everyone knows this is how you do it, in a way for us to manage the flow of the meeting. So in this case, you've seen I've kind of done a refer to committee, then a lay on the table, and they might all fail, and we come back to the First Amendment. As indicated, then you can always have points of information, which are just interruptions. They're just kind of, can I get better information? I don't understand. What do you mean by the harmonies or something? And so that someone can explain what the harmonies are. Similarly, someone can say, question of privilege. I can't hear I didn't hear that argument or something, and get that repeated. Those are all ways to interrupt the flow, but we always go back to the flow. There's no breaking of the process. But then if someone then raises the previous question, the idea of the previous question is now saying, let's have a vote. And in that previous question, we basically can say we are cutting the discussion on the whole thing. We are coming back to now voting on the First Amendment and the main motion. Okay. So yeah, I think in terms of I'm not going to go through the recap. I think what we can do is, if we've got a few more minutes for people who have questions. So yeah. So let's start. Should I let's start with Brighton?
Helps if you unmute. Thank you very much, Keith, for that very informative session. I've got a couple, some of them are comments, and just testing my understanding of what you've just presented. The 50% plus one and the 2/3 majority, and where we need to take care of the rights of the minority would be 2/3. But how do you come to that decision? Is that something that's arbitrary, something that's subjective? Then...
Yeah, sorry,
okay.
You carry on. Yeah.
Okay, I've got a couple more. When does subsidiary come in? And my intuition would be that immediately after the motion has been read out, then you can actually raise the subsidiary motions to that. And then referring to committee suspends the motion altogether. You then don't go through the motion at that point if you do come to the decision to suspend. And then maybe, the hierarchy we can look at. And postpone indefinitely versus the postpone is an interesting one. I just want a bit of clarity between the difference between the two. Postpone indefinitely takes it off, and postpone, you come back to it at some point, I suppose.
Yeah, correct. Let's start with that last one. Absolutely. That's the main difference, is that the postponement is just saying we need to postpone and come back to this at a future point. And so then there you do make sure that you are going to come back to that. The postpone indefinitely means that it's off the table. We're never coming back to that point because it's kind of felt that it's not a reasonable discussion for us to be having at this point. And if the majority decide to agree to that, then it's gone. You never come back to that. In terms of when it's a two-thirds or a simple majority, I'm trying to look for my chart of motions, but there is a fantastic simplification, a chart of motions that's put together by Robert's Rules of Order, and Toastmasters put it into quite a neat package that we use then for the parliamentarian, and I'll make sure that that the district leadership team have this, because it's also really useful. It's a summary of, is it interruptible? Can you interrupt a speaker? Is it debatable? Is it amendable? What majority is required for that? So it kind of helps you when you're in the gist of it, is to work out that. And also, yes, when you talked about when these things can be done, it's also the idea is that there's an order, but firstly, the motion always has to be approved. So you've got a proposer, you've got a seconder, then you start. As I said, only one of them, which was the objection, has to be raised before you start debating. Almost all the others can actually come up during the debate. And then even the one where you want to postpone indefinitely, that can come up at some point during the debate when somebody feels this is getting awkward and they're not comfortable with this, where this is going. Let's do the postpone indefinitely to shut it down, or even bring it to a vote to shut it down. But the postpone indefinitely, what makes it different from say like a limit on debate or going to the previous question, is that you don't have to resolve whether the motion is right or wrong. You just basically kill it so that you don't have to deal with it at all, because it's too embarrassing whether we vote yes or no. We just don't want to have to vote on this at all. And if the majority accepts that, then it just doesn't reach a resolution. I hope that makes sense, right? Cool.
Thanks.
Great.
Thanks.
Lillian. Yeah, great. Thanks. Lillian?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I have got a question to ask about a previous thing that happened at the convention where somebody brought a motion to the floor, but wasn't on the agenda before the time. And that was where the people had to pay when they went to America, and they had to pay in their personal capacity. And they just raised that on the floor on the day, and people weren't prepared. And I felt unprepared, and I felt that the debate, everybody had three chances, like pro, con, pro, con, pro, con, pro, con. But for me, it wasn't investigated thoroughly enough. And then it was voted on with insufficient, I felt, very insufficient information. So when somebody brings something to the floor, how can we not have this where, because that financially impacted people a lot. And I was shocked at how it impacted people. And the vote for me was, it didn't go. Robert's Rule sounds all nice and chirpy and stuff like that. But for me, in that instance, it wasn't, they just brought this like blindsided. For me, that motion was like blindsided because no one had prepared or thought about it or considered it. And right at that moment, you had to suddenly debate a very deep question with a lot of repercussions. And so I just want, these motions that come from the floor to be dealt with a little bit more, maybe postponing it or something like that to get more information. That's just my request.
Great. Thanks, Lillian. I think, yeah, absolutely. If it's one of those tricky things when the chair is making a call in terms of the procedure for a vote, because, most of the people in the room just want to get out of there. And so it's always a thing to kind of like, how can we make sure we debate this properly in the time that we have, and still get to a resolution? And sometimes that does mean that you don't have sufficient debate, and that's why something like postpone indefinitely or refer to a committee are powerful if the people in the room feel, hang on, I don't have enough information to make this call. I want this to go away until we have better information. And I think that's an important one. So I was talking about the one with Mauritius years ago, was also then like people just felt, well, we don't know enough. What are the consequences? What does district have to do? What does TI have to do? Let's then refer to a committee. And that was then done. That was the decision. So yes, I think it's important then that if we feel that the debate is kind of moving in a direction and nobody feels comfortable that we're actually getting to the resolution that makes sense because we don't feel that we have enough information, it's either to then postpone indefinitely, or to refer to a committee to come back with a better view. So yeah, I think that is something for us to bear in mind, and it's kind of one of those things that we learn from experience. Toastmasters is all about learning. We will make mistakes. We trip over ourselves. I know, I've as a parliamentarian, I've done it in the past as well. And so you learn from people who've been there before, and you get better at it. So I would say yes. One of the important things is allow for debate, but also have a way for people to move the debate aside. And and also I'm talking from experience here. One of our most complicated motions that we have to deal with is the alignment. And that can get really complicated. And the whole idea is to try and provide as much information ahead of time so people are aware, and then manage the level of the debate and what are we resolving before you move on to the next thing. So that can also be a really important lesson, and we learn out of these processes. Thanks, Lillian. Big Cesar? Yeah.
Thank you, Keith. My question, I think it's something we've dealt with, but I think it will help for me to, or for us to get more information on it. Let's say you are debating something, and I'm going to put an example here. The club says, okay, someone has put a motion that to achieve our DCP goals, let's meet every week, which would mean in a month we would meet 4 times. Let's meet at least once a month. And during the debate, someone has a brainwave and raises another idea to say, look, instead of doing that, why can't we then meet in 1 week, we meet 4 successive days? Is that treated as a new motion, or is it an amendment to a motion? And if it's a new motion, what do you do with it? Do we debate it there and then, or do we then put it to the next council meeting, or what do you say? Do you say lay it on the table or something like that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good one, because I'm also now trying to work out, because the whole idea is amending a motion, it must be germane to the motion. And in this instance, it is, but you kind of then have to look at the wording very carefully. So if the motion was, we will meet once a week for 4 weeks, and then someone says, we will meet every day for 1 week, is that germane? And I think it is, because you're still dealing with the same thing. You're not like totally sinking a proposal. So I think that's a reasonable thing to do, because you're dealing with when we meet, and you're just changing the wording of when we meet. So I think that would then be the amendment. So you're looking at the amendment, and if people prefer the amendment, then you pass that, and then you have to pass the main motion with the amendment. So it's important thing is that just by passing the amendment doesn't mean you've passed it. You actually have to go back and pass the main motion with the amended words. So yes, and that's one of the dangers, and it's a very good point. So I'm glad you raised it. It's like trying to manage what is amending something and what is completely separate. And I think in this case would be an amendment, but that would be the chair's call. Somebody may object, and then we have to do a vote on the objection. But I think in this case, it makes sense that it is germane to what we're discussing. Yeah. Yeah, if you remember, I think we had an interesting discussion on this at the last council meeting, where we were rescinding the previous, and this comes back to what Lillian was raising about the decision we had made. And then after the fact, people went and thought about it a bit more and realized we had made a mistake and went and rescinded the previous decision. But then we had a motion that actually changed the nature of so it was an amendment, which we then ruled was not germane. We went and discussed it, and it kind of like they came back and said, yeah, that's not an appropriate amendment. So then we went back to the main amendment. So yeah, it's a tricky one to get right, but sometimes there is judgment for the chair as to what's acceptable. Yeah. Great. I'm not seeing any other hands, and I think we've just gone over our committed time. So I hope everybody's good. Thanks very much for your time this morning, and I hope it was useful. And we will hopefully see most of you in 2 weeks' time at the council meeting. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Keith. Everybody, can we please just give you my round of applause? I think you are an amazing facilitator. Thank you, sir. And I would like to hand over to our district director to just close off our session. Becky Cesar, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Keith. Our past district director, Keith Bowen, for coming through and helping us with these rules. And it helps us so that we can have an efficient and effective council meeting, and for some of us, executive meeting. And it helps to glean and learn from these past leaders that have gone through the road and they've read the books, and gives us the wisdom and confidence that we will be able to handle such meetings. And thank you to everyone that took their Saturday morning to come through here so that we can learn and be ready for our next meeting. It is not in 2 weeks. I think it's in a week's time. We will be in our council meeting. So around about this time, we probably will be debating, and I look forward to respectful debates. I look forward to an effective and efficient meeting, and a meeting that will actually help District 74 to move forward. I'm looking forward to seeing some of you in Lesotho, some of you will see online. And Keith, once again, thank you for availing yourself to be our parliamentarian. I'm excited and look forward to having this council meeting and the executive meeting. Now, I think I can adjourn the meeting. Have an awesome weekend, everyone.
Thanks. Cheers, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Becky.
Bye.